You're not muted. Okay, great. Okay. Hello. Oh, wow, cool. Hello. Well, welcome everyone to the May New York chapter of AEE chapter meeting, technical session. Do I hear an echo? Well said. Okay, great. Thanks. Couple of things, just one thing before we go through the announcements, before we get to the technical session. I don't know how many people have tried AI with this Chat GPT. Has anyone logged on to that and tried that? You've heard of it, right? Or at least you've heard of it, right? I urge you to try it. I got curious and just not too much of a glimpse into my personal life, but we were at dinner with friends that we've known for 30 years. I asked my wife to type in a prompt for it, and within 10 seconds, it generated a poem about these three couples that have been getting together for 30 years. Blew my mind. So you look into it more, and it turns out that the developers make no claim whatsoever about any of it being true or accurate. And so, in fact, I used it. I went home, I used it and asked it to generate some text for me for decarbonization. It seems like a useful idea, right? And it was nonsense, complete nonsense. And so it turns out that when AI creates this stuff, the technical term the developers call is hallucination. That's what the AI does. And the irony was not lost on me that one of the most transformative technologies of our time acts like it's on mushrooms. And it's crazy. But that's a sign of the times, I suppose. And I bring that up because AI was on the topic of today's session. Okay, here's our announcements for this month. The gala is on the 20th of June. I urge everyone to register. Starting, I believe, probably like tomorrow, there'll be an opportunity to register for the gala. And that's at Club 101. The mid-year memberships will be available till June 30th or July 1st. It's a discount on the gala and on the technical sessions. If you attended the March meeting and requested CEU credits, they were working through the mechanics of those, and those will go out in a couple of weeks time frame is what we're looking at. One change about the CEU starting next year, starting with the September meeting, we're changing to a you must be present to win model. So although we will still have hybrid meetings where people can attend through Zoom online to gain the CEU credits, you'll have to attend. And I believe what we're shooting for, right, David, is like we used to do it, the CEU certificates would be issued at the meeting. Right? Okay, great. So that will simplify that tremendously. In July, the board gets together to pick out the topics for the coming year. So that's usually a free-for-all with rounds and rounds of voting. But the thing we need more than anything else is ideas to pour into the mix. So if you have ideas for topics for these technical sessions that you think have merit, please feel free to email the info website, the info address on the website, and we'd love to hear about those. Thank you very much for all the chapter award applications that we got. The awards have been selected, and they all sound great, and they will be announced at the gala. A plug for AEE East in Boston on June 7th. Also on June 7th and 8th. On June 7th, NYIT is hosting an Energy Careers and Professional Societies meeting in Old Westbury. And that's outreach to young professionals and students. And this chapter is sending us speakers. Yours truly, I'll do my best not to embarrass myself or the chapter. And then let's acknowledge our corporate sponsors: Dual Fuel, DNV, Innoventive Power, Leidos, NPower, Metergy, Utilivisor, Train, NYSERDA, C-Power, Fisher Energy, EIS, EMAX Systems, Inc., Aramark, NYIT, Metergy, and Thermax. And with that, I'm thank Michael Bodker and Sissy Bai for putting this session together, and I'm going to turn it over to Sissy. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sissy Bai. So today I'm just going to give you a quick introduction about today's meeting's topic and our speaker's bio. So our main chapter meeting will look at current digital data applications and issues impacting our industry, including both energy meter data and building operational data. Driven by state regulators, energy metering has taken a huge leap to electronic smart meters, giving users access to granular interval data. Con Edison has installed over 5 million meters at its territory. And unfortunately, they couldn't make this meeting today. And this is independent of some meters for tenants or systems. This huge reservoir of data offers both challenges and opportunities. On the end user side, our building control systems have moved from local systems with limited data capabilities to digital systems that capture records of every control parameter. Even small homes increasingly have smart thermostats as part of the growing Internet of Things wave with its data connection to the cloud. So this trends leave us three questions. First, how is the energy meter data managed and to what uses can it be put? Second, is the building operational data accessible and structured so that it can be readily used? Third, can it be merged with energy use data? So we're very honored today to have three speakers join us and join our meeting today. Each of them will bring their insights and respond to those three questions from the building operations perspective to the utility grid operations. So without further ado, the first speaker for today is Terry here. Terry is the founder of Principal of Controls Integrator Intellimation, working out of Philadelphia. Beyond the typical role of a BAS controls integrator, Intellimation works at the cutting edge of the integration across control platforms and the building platforms to enable cloud-based supervision and intelligence for automated fault detection and diagnosis and building system optimization. Terry is a master electrician, holds a bachelor's degree in physics, and has taught HVAC controls at Lehigh University. Terry, the floor is yours.
Somebody must have embellished that because I don't think I wrote all that. Okay, good evening. So my background is definitely in building automation. I pretty much spent my career in that space for the last 30 years. So, and in the last probably 8 or so years, shifted our focus into what I'll call beyond BAS or analytics or all of these newer technologies that connect to the building automation system and try to leverage that information. Just I guess a little bit of what the slides are going to cover and what I'm going to talk about. I played with ChatGPT a little bit as well, and I've heard certainly I've heard people, obviously for programmers, it's really been it is and will be a boost in productivity. For building automation folks, I've already know that there's people that are using it to write code for building automation systems. And what's interesting about that, it certainly is very good at writing Java and Python because there's a lot of that out there in the public domain that this thing learned on. But one of the unfortunate things we have in the building automation space is every one of the vendors seems to want to invent their own programming environment. I mean, it's a sorry state, but that's the way it is. So they have it has less to really learn on. But I still think it will be a help our industry as well in terms of productivity. Programmable logic controller. So BAS is real simple. We've got a lot of controllers, PLCs, and we're pretty much, this building automation system hasn't really changed a heck of a lot in 30 years. Besides the controllers talking BACnet, in the past they talked proprietary protocols. Today they talk BACnet, but it's still a fixed programmable controller that gets programmed typically once at the beginning of the building, and it usually doesn't change much in 20, 30, 40 years. In fact, we do, we're out of Philadelphia, but we do work in DC, Philadelphia, New York City. And one of the buildings in New York City that we work on, actually, there's a controller from Johnson Controls called a DX9100, probably the most popular controller that I've ever seen out in the industry. It was very popular. The first controller I ever learned to program in '95 was that controller. We have a building in New York City. We have about 75 of those in that building still hurrying along just fine. So anyhow, not much has changed, but recently, or in the last, let's say, 8 or so years, in fact, probably longer than that, I tell people what sort of changed my mind about building automation systems, and it's beyond BAS stuff, is I saw my first demo of an FDD tool in 2005 from a company called Symmetrics out of Boston. At the time, there was probably only, to my knowledge, and I did a fair amount of research on this, only about 3 FDD tools, in the US. They were one, so they were the early one. I was so enamored and blown away with that. I thought, man, all my clients need this, but there weren't any that could afford it. It was fairly expensive at the time. And we didn't do much about it. I just watched that industry over time. And in 2014, I thought the technology had evolved enough. Prices had come down. It's better. Prices had come down, that it was more applicable to more buildings. So we kind of shifted gears. So instead of doing primarily building automation systems, now we consider ourselves a master systems integrator, and we go out and connect to existing buildings, BAS, call that brownfield, and meter data if they have it, and connect that, trend it all, send it to the cloud, and then run applications on it. And what's helped promote that was certainly BACnet. A big shout out to BACnet, because now integrating those systems are much easier than it used to be, because they all talk the same language. We have some data modeling and tagging standards. One of the problems with BS data, it's incredibly messy. The industry never had a point naming standard, so when you discover it, it's named all different things, and so Haystack and Brick are 2 of 4 or 5 or 6 data modeling standards, data tagging standards, and once you have that data connected, trended, and modeled, you open the door for a lot of digital transformation. Applications can use that data. We're seeing this sort of transformation in a lot of industries. The BS is just one of many. Industrial, IoT, BIoT, Buildings Internet of Things, and IoT, Industrial Internet of Things. Besides what's happening in the BAS industry, we have cloud computing. So compute power at a much better price point than we used to have. We have time series databases. Years ago, there was one OSI soft. Now there's, every few months, I see another time series database. So the prices of those have come down dramatically. So it just made the enabling of this big data analytics sort of movement. One thing I wanted to mention, BAS historically had a lot of data. They didn't really use it for much, but real-time control. Mostly the BAS's first thing is to just control. It has inputs, it has outputs. It's got a program in the middle, and it's just maintaining temperature, primarily ventilation rates. And that data was typically not trended, or if it was, maybe only 10% of it was. And so it wasn't really used for anything else. This type of technology makes the ability to mine that information for lots of additional things besides fault detection. That's certainly one of them. So this independent data layer is a fairly recent term that defines what we would call the connecting layer between the building automation system, the brownfield that most commercial buildings all have, and the cloud, or additional applications like FDD, Energy Information Systems. These are acronyms that I've seen over time. I think DOE has this term called EMIS, Energy Management Information System, and it tends to combine all of these other applications under that umbrella. That independent data layer helps enable all of those applications. In theory, and we're getting there, when you connect to a building, you collect all the data and you tag it, model it, those applications can be deployed at a much reduced cost. Historically, each one of these applications would have to hand map the data themselves, and you'd have to buy, so you buy an EIS. Those used to be standalone. They still are, there's still products like that, but pretty much every FDD tool now has EIS built into it. We're getting to the point where some of these FDD tools are also doing the optimization piece. We're seeing a merge of some of that technology. They were historically all very separate. Kind of a diagram of what it looks like. This is the existing brownfield system. We connect, and I say we, there's lots of folks like us doing this type of thing. So it is just a common way of doing it. Those are the applications, few of the applications that we use, but there's that application list is very
Question.
Yeah.
You used the word brownfield. It's different from
yeah,
toxic waste site. Could you elaborate?
sure. Yeah, so brownfield and greenfield are the two, the contrast. Greenfield, so I consider an existing infrastructure BAS system for the most part, an existing building to be brownfield. Greenfield is typically newer IoT technology, oftentimes wireless. We've been embellishing or adding to BASs because they typically are missing some sensors. You have LoRa WAN technology now. So, all right, I got to keep moving. I'm gonna go through some. These are just more applications that can run on top of that. These are some slides from DOE, and so I thought these are some applications, again, big data applications, fault detection, analytics, mining that BAS data and meter data and greenfield data if you add to it. Most of this is, I think, a great curve because a lot of buildings have a BAS. So this technology is very far developed. Again, I don't know, of the buildings that we touch, 95% have a BAS. I would say most buildings above 50,000 square feet probably have one. If they don't, they should. These are some of the EIS has been around a fair amount, fairly well developed. FDD, I believe, is about here on the adoption curve and picking up steam. Automatic system optimization. I've seen not NYSERDA, ComEd, both of them have programs, pilots on this automatic system optimization now, where FDD has been passive. It just churns through data and tells you when there's a problem. It doesn't fix anything, doesn't do anything on its own. You have to do something. This looks at how your building is operating and then runs advanced algorithms to actually write back and control the building better. Somewhat like guideline 36, sequences of operation, in an existing building. So if you want to retrofit an existing building with guideline 36, or we're seeing some folks talking about AI and machine learning. We are seeing some of that. We think that's coming, where the buildings will be optimized with some form of machine learning. Very early on, Probably a lot of hype at the moment. Some of the paybacks, 13% on average is what the industry has shown you can get by retrofitting a building with FDD and optimization. Typically, the bulk of that comes from the HVAC system. So you're probably getting 30% savings on the HVAC. Overall, that's 13%. So the ROI is good. Many utilities, including NYSERDA, PECO in Philadelphia, in DC, in Maryland, they have rebates for that. Almost most of the work that we do, we get a rebate for it. What we get or the owner gets. This may be a little hype. Can we get to a fully autonomous building? I think we're working our way there. A little shout out to CUNY Building Performance Lab and Michael Bachker for inviting me here. And one of the things that that we've learned and why we're working with them is that the building operators need to be brought into this fold. You can't turn this technology on without their involvement. So we're training building operators to understand this technology, understand what it's due and what you can do with it. I think is incredibly important because they're the gatekeepers. A little marketing stuff will buy that. You guys will get these slides. These are just some resources. Some of the folks that done a lot of groundbreaking work in this building automation or advanced optimization work. Whenever you connect the building, whenever you get rid of the air gap that most buildings have now and connect it, you have to be aware of cybersecurity. It's doable. These are just some products that we've used and help make that connection secure. We do think that if a building could and maybe in the future will operate autonomously, what we need from the building operators is to be able to, because let's face it, things do break. Sensors go bad, actuators go bad. This is moving machinery. And when it breaks, the automation has got to break. It doesn't matter whether it's machine learning or AI or any of that, it's going to break. And so we certainly have to pay a lot of attention to getting those things fixed quicker. Operator training. I've mentioned that. I think these are some other folks that do that sort of thing. Michael, how do you do?
On time, if that's what you're asking.
Yeah. Let me see if there's any other notes here I wanted to really cover. Just one comment. I would say the average building automation system, I'd say 1,000 to 5,000 points of data, right? So a typical building automation is going to have 1,000 physical inputs and outputs, 1,000 to 5,000, and we've seen buildings with 20,000. So you trend that data every 5 minutes and you save it forever. There's a lot of wealth of information there that you can mine for it, and that's what this you can know how the building operates. You can know what's wrong with it. You can tell that if your mixed air damper is leaking, and that's something a BAS can't do. So this technology has come down in price. The ability to leverage it, I think, is valuable. So I think again, 5 years from now, I don't know, the saturation rate at the moment might be less than 10%. We think in 5 years that should be 40 or 50%.
So we were going to have a panel at the end. So hold your broad questions, but if you have a specific question that you want to get resolved now, please have time for at least one question.
All the data mining you're doing, when you forward it, when you look at it like as a predictor, are you seeing any tools pop up that would be multiple stakeholder interest? For example, you have all the data coming from the building on FDD, and you've got data, and you're looking at the performance of a given system. At some juncture, the feed of that cost could then feed a simple payback model, right? So you can look at that as an alarm goes off and says, your 10-year payback just went to 2 years because of the efficiency Are you seeing anything like that pop up?
Sure. Well, yes, there's other ROIs besides energy efficiency. Certainly, we think maintenance costs. You can troubleshoot, you can look at the data and figure out what could be wrong with that piece of equipment before you roll a truck. So we think maintenance cost is probably at least 10-15% savings by having that data available. We think at some point, the Baltimore Air Coil people would want all of the data you have on their cooling towers. The VRF guys would want data on that. So we think there's even revenue streams you can get by providing some of that data to manufacturers.
You know, it's like the old vibration analysis, right? The more they kept rolling it over, the more accurate it got.
Yeah.
So, cool. This presentation.
Okay.
All right, so the following two speakers will give presentation online. And the next one we have is David Zhang. Right, David is controlling right now. All right, so David is a director at KW Engineering. He integrates M&V into demand side resource projects, into energy efficiency, demand reduction, on-site generation, and energy storage. He has authored practical M&V guidance documents and templates, provided M&V training and technical review, developed public domain software, including KW Engineers R code, and led industry groups to advance and simplify M&V as data becoming more available. Methodologies developed and the tools continue to be improved. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sissy. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Michael and Sissy for inviting me, giving me an opportunity to talk to you about something that I've been doing, pretty passionate about for the last 10 years or so, and that's use of interval data and advances in M&V. And this dovetails a little bit with Terry's presentation. We're talking about the whole building level mainly. So yeah, I have a lot of slides and I hope I can get through them all, but I'm sure Michael will let me know. So let's see. Yeah, I just want to talk about the benefits of interval data. That's how I framed this presentation and how it's helped M&V, particularly whole building methods in recent years. So a little bit, I'll talk about inside about how a building uses energy and how interval data helps that. But really the benefits for M&V are making better energy models, getting faster feedback on savings performance, and getting some insight on how to treat non-routine events. And those are things that can really bias your savings estimates. So getting going. What is interval data? We call it AMI data in California. It's an acronym for Advanced Metering Infrastructure. California invested a couple $2 billion in installing advanced metering in all buildings in the state. Previously, interval data was available from time of use meters in large buildings, I believe over 200 kilowatts in use. But now you can get it in all buildings for electric and gas and even houses. Typically, we get electric data 15-minute intervals and natural gas on daily, but in some regions you can get hourly. But the greatest thing about it, and Terry touched on this a little bit, was you can access the data. Customers can get their own interval data through an API. In California, we call it Green Button Connect, and I'm told in New York you have Utility API, which is an even better version of those interfaces. So that allows a customer to get access to the data, give it to their providers or to their energy management information systems and so on. So you can do a lot of this stuff online as well. My perspective is doing energy efficiency projects, however. So just real quick, some of the benefits of interval data without looking at the M&V aspect of it at all yet is more data gives you better insight, tells you when you're using energy throughout a day, a week, a season, a year. Tells you when those peak periods each day are, magnitude of the base loads and some unusual behavior in this example in this building. We had a chiller staging on and off throughout the peak period in the day, the occupied period in the day. You can see that in the oscillations in this chart. You can also see how much energy is being used in the building when nobody's there, whether you should be able to do something about that. Clue in. So it's a real good tool, just give you insights about how your building's using energy, where energy efficiency opportunities might be, can make you real building whisperers, I'd like to say. And just a quick demonstration of M&V here. We're talking about option C, it's a whole building approach. Generally, we're going to talk about avoided energy use. Just to demonstrate that, if you plot energy use over time, you have 3 distinct periods. You have a baseline period where you have some energy, excuse me. Then installation period where hopefully you're installing measures and energy use is trending downward, and then a post-installation period where hopefully you have lower energy use. To quantify savings, you build a model out of the baseline period. That's the energy use data, maybe temperature data or production data, occupancy data, whatever data you get. We're talking about a statistical model, regression, and then you use that model to predict what the baseline use would have been in the reporting period or the post-installation period. The difference between that and the actual use in that period is your savings. So simple concept, often misunderstood, but that's what we're talking about today. We can also do a normalized savings approach, and that's the same 3 periods, except you have some normal conditions period. That's usually a long-term weather period. If you want to express your savings under typical conditions, in case your post-install period is in an extreme weather year or something. And the only difference is you're making an additional model out of the reporting period or the post-installation period, making predictions. And the difference between those two are the normalized. But just to set the stage a little bit about whole building M&V, is what that was about. So how does interval data help us, really? That's what the question is. And the answer really is more data. Anytime you have more data, you can build better statistical models. So if you have better models, you can make more accurate models and make more accurate savings estimates. So here's just a little table I threw together showing, based on the number of points per year where I'd recommend doing energy savings calculations and peak demand savings calculations. And really, for energy savings calculations, there's no need to go beyond daily, to hourly or 15-minute or lower time intervals. If you can get daily data, you can do fairly robust analysis for energy savings there. For demand savings, not so much, although you can make peak demand estimates with daily data. You use sort of a representative load curve of a similar building or class of buildings, similar to your building. Adjust your daily peak demand by the energy use of that day. It's an approximation, but it's more reasonable than nothing, I guess. Get down to hourly, you can start doing average peak demand calculations. And if you get down to 15-minute, you can actually do coincident demand. Let's see, I only have half my time left, so let me move fast. Option C is traditionally monthly building analysis, 12 points per year, have less accuracy, and you can't account for non-routine events, things that are changing your building energy use that are not due to your measures. I'll explain a little bit more. You generally have to use separate engineering calculations. Advanced M&V, M&V 2.0 is often called. It's basically the same methodology, you just have more data. So you get more granularity in the volume of data, you get better models, you get fast feedback. You can automate this with the green button connect and APIs to an energy management information system platform, for example. Really integrate that M&V capability to other things. That, for example, what Terry was talking about. It also it enables pay-for-performance financing. I shouldn't say that. You could do that with monthly data as well. It enables to have more confidence in the results of those kind of incentive structures. Data quality is always an issue. You got to be aware of gaps and outliers, and repeated values and timestamps. It applies to all your data streams, whether it's utility data or weather data or occupancy data, or production data. Generally with utility data, it's not as much of a problem, but you should still check. Weather data is really going to be the source of your data issue. We want to use advanced analytics in when you have interval data. I'll show an example in a minute. Two of the popular algorithms are the hash rate change point models. There's an example out there to the right, 3-parameter cooling model, where the energy use increases after the cooling systems have been switched on and increases with ambient temperature afterwards. They'll put out a modeling algorithm called the time of week and temperature model, and that counts for the day of week or the time of week. And that could be either an hour a week or a day of week. So you can have 168 indicator variables in your regression model, or 7, depending on whether it's an hour or a day. And then there's more fancy models, but I'm not going to talk about that. Just in the demonstration, I had some daily data from a building locally and I ran a linear model on it, and you can see how well that prediction doesn't match the data in that upper chart. And in the lower chart, using the advanced model, you can see it's much better match of the weekend use and peak use during the weekdays. And you always ask yourself, how good's the model? There's various ways to do that. Generally, standards are, they got to meet certain goodness to fit metrics. In California, we use the net mean bias error. It should be very low, less than 0.5%. The random error, represented by this coefficient of variation, the root mean squared error, should be less than 25. But really what we should use and ask the question is, well, if I'm going to get X amount of savings in my building, how accurate am I going to know it given this model? And so you can calculate the uncertainty using that fractional savings uncertainty formula that ASHRAE provides you. See if you get it less than 50%. And then the confidence interval, ASHRAE only requires 68%, but we use 90%. It's a little stricter in California. R-squared is often cited as a goodness of fit metric, but there's problems with it, particularly if your energy use doesn't vary very much with any independent variables. It's pretty flat, let's say. R-squared is going to be poor in those cases, but you can still make perfectly good models out of those. So I have a little trouble with R-squared often. There's other best practices. In the interest of time, I'm just going to skip over it. Just say that you should have good weather coverage, and your regression should sort of adhere to the assumptions of linear regression. Not saying much more. Other advantage of interval data is that it can really show you your savings performance. You can make a baseline model and predict it. That's what that baseline, that black line is, and the difference between that and the bars is your savings. You can develop a Q-sum chart during the installation period, and it shows you that you're starting to save or not the time after that measure is installed, and you can track that and see if you're on track to save what you expect. You can see how additional EEMs are installed, the slope changes of that Q-sum chart. So it's kind of a diagnostic tool, but it is giving you feedback on the performance of your measures. There's other energy dashboards we put on this topic also. I want to talk about risks. I have a couple of examples I want to get into. The risks are the building may not be predictable. So you want to get a year of data and run a model and see if you can actually make a decent model out of it. If you can't, then it's not a good candidate for an option C approach. But the other risks are non-routine events, and those are events that happen in your building, maybe added or removed loads that will bias your savings estimate. And you need to be able to handle those because you never know when they're going to occur during the course of your project. So non-routine events, as I said, are changes in building or its operations that are unrelated to the measures. And so you need to make adjustments for the large NREs. And the preferred way to do that is with interval data. And to do that, you need additional independent variables. And that'll allow you to analyze the impact of the NRE within the model. And just comparing that with monthly data, as I said before, you need a separate calculation to quantify that impact of that NRE. And all you're really doing is adding more uncertainty to your savings estimate. So here's just a little example. We had a baseline period in a lab building, wasn't very sensitive to ambient temperature, but you can see in the early period, it had 2 low use periods. When we saw that in the data, we talked to the facility owner, found out that they shut off a bunch of electric loads in those periods of time. So we confirmed those dates and added indicator variables as an additional independent variable in the model. And when we did that, we got a pretty good match between the model predictions and the data. If we didn't do that, that orange line would be somewhere in between that high and low periods of the actual data, the blue line. And so that helped us make a better model and anticipate when that might happen again, so we can make that adjustment in our savings calculations. But here's the cool example. We did another project where it was a city hall and a theater attached to it prior to the COVID period. So we made a baseline model of these goodness of fit statistics. You know, the R squared isn't that high, isn't that impressive. And the CDR-MFC is acceptable, you know, but, you know, so this model, we decided to go forward with it. And during the performance period, COVID hit. And so buildings empty out during COVID and have low use. And so how are we going to account for that? That's the NRE. So how are we going to do that? So we, during the performance period, you know, we made this baseline model prior to COVID and submitted our project application, which included the M&B plan and so on. During COVID, said, oh, how are we going to account for that? So we talked to the building operator. And it turns out that all the fans in that building were driven by variable frequency drives. And we could get the VFD signals from all the fans in the theater portion. And in the theater, you know, that in the baseline period, you know, there was rehearsals and events, varying use of that. And so it varied during the baseline period, as well as the theater was totally shut off or abandoned during the COVID period. And so if we use that as an additional independent variable, that variable speed drive data, there were like 6 fans. We took all the signals and averaged them together and then normalized them to 0 and 1, because all we cared about was the variation in data. And we redid the baseline model, including that. You can see that it improved the goodness of fit, the R squared, the CDR-MFC values quite a bit. You can see that the baseline model fits the data much better than without that independent one, without that additional independent variable. And then when we did the savings calculation, the black line represents the baseline prediction without the additional variable, and the blue line represents it with the additional occupancy variable. And then the difference in the amounts of savings that were estimated from this project are shown. There's about 25,000 difference. So that was just a nice, fortunate situation where we had the data and we could include it in the MD. And these techniques are being built into EMS systems and everything. You know, they take a little bit more knowledge and customization to the particular build. So I just want to show how interval data helps address issues like this and improve the M&V overall. And want to leave you with just a list of some tools that you can pick up and use. There's a couple that are free. One is NMECR, which is our code software that our company KW Engineering puts out. It's on GitHub. You can go there and download it. It's free. There's some information there that helps you understand how to use it. Another one that's popular is ECAM, Energy Charting and Metrics tool. That's actually an add-in to an Excel, Microsoft Excel. I believe it implements all the ASHRAE change point models. NMECR will do multiple modeling algorithms, time of week and temperature, change point, and simple linear regression, and so on. Then there's other software out there that you have to pay a fee for. There's just a couple examples listed there. So sorry if I went too fast, but I can take questions now.
Thank you, David. So once again, we'll have a panel at the end. David will wait, but if there are short questions now, we can take 1 or 2. I'm not seeing any. That's an interesting phenomenon in and of itself. Okay. Thank you, David.
Right.
We able to get the slides?
All right, so that leaves us to,
Excuse me one second. Question, get the slides. Yes, the slides will be posted.
Give us about a week or so, because it's all done by volunteers. Thank you.
all right, so that'll give us the final presenter speaker today, which is Henry Richardson. He's a senior analyst at What Time. Henry enables partners and collaborators to understand how they can affect the electric grid and achieve greater reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, whether through location-based renewable siting or by incorporating load flexibility into their solutions. Henry specializes in carbon accounting, building performance, emissions, focus load shifting, and energy storage integration. Henry, please share your slide and the floor is yours.
Sissy, want to mention that the test, the quiz online is going to be after this, chat.
Yeah, so for folks who join online, we will put on the link to the quiz that, you can take it for the CU credits at the end of this meeting. So yeah, please keep an eye on the chat box. Thank you.
All right, should I proceed?
Yeah, you
Excellent.
could.
Hello, everyone. So folks have talked a lot about measuring the building, how to assess different performance. I'm going to take a slightly wider view and look at the electric grid and how emissions on the electric grid work. So I'll do a little bit of background on the electric grid, and I'll touch on two quick data types and applications of that data for buildings. And then also touch on local law 97, specifically the TOU pathway, which has an emissions focused approach. I have a deck of slides here. I'm gonna go through them pretty quickly, but feel free to interrupt as you go through if something doesn't make sense, or if you have a particular question about something that I'm covering at that time. Does that sound reasonable?
Yes.
Excellent. So I'm with Watt Time. We're a nonprofit that's actually focused on giving people energy choice. I'll go into a little bit of what we mean by energy choice, but we're trying to give people information and agency to change their electricity consumption and then so that directly affects emissions on the electric grid. We came out of UC Berkeley, where we were formed by a bunch of volunteers. We're working with a whole range of different partners to really bring this data stream to achieve real world emissions reductions. And I'll dig into a little bit of what that means. So first I want to talk about how the electric grid works and how emissions come from it so that we have a common grounding. So I like to start with this slide because traditionally the world has always thought in megawatt hours or kilowatt hours. So if you have a building in California, you put on solar on the roof of it, you would be considered net zero, or emissions. The emissions are kind of net zero emissions on an annual basis. And so that was always done on a kilowatt hour basis. People kind of focused efficiency measures on kilowatt hours, also demand response based on kilowatts. So it's really the common parlance was really kilowatts or kilowatt hours, occasionally cost if you're talking about LEED or other standards. And we're really the reason I bring this up is because when we start talking about emissions and you start differentiating that, you can start to see different effects. So if a building in California consumes electricity, it induces emissions into the atmosphere and causes emissions. And that same amount of the same number of kilowatt hours actually don't displace the same amount of emissions as that building causes because of when it's generating. So you can start to see timing really starts to matter. This begins to get to the question of why granular data is so important. And then if you take that same number of kilowatt hours and put them in Virginia instead of California, those kilowatt hours are actually displacing much dirtier resources than the wind, the solar and natural gas that are being displaced in California. So you can start to see both location and timing have a huge effect on how much emissions a building or efficiency measure or different intervention might cause. For the building conversations, there's usually not a lot of flexibility in where you site your buildings. When we talk to large corporate partners, they can site their renewable energy pretty much anywhere in the world, or at least the US, since we say put it in places where it's dirtier. So you're pushing off those dirtier resources. Buildings, unless you're building like data centers, don't typically have that same type of flexibility. And so you can start to see this grid emissions vary by time throughout the day. So you can start to imagine strategies that begin to address this, either shifting strategies. Can you shift out of this evening, afternoon peak into this low emissions period in the morning? Yep.
Yeah, can I interrupt? Can you kind of discuss the difference between marginal emissions and average emissions and how people can use those interchangeably depending upon how they're talking about emissions from the grid?
Absolutely. Let me think about how the best way to do that is. So actually, if I start here, so what this chart is showing is when you consume electricity, which power plant is responding to that change in load, thus the marginal generator. And that marginal generator changes depending on where you are in the country. So in California, it's primarily a mix of natural gas and solar. In the Great Plains or the Midwest, it's primarily coal and natural gas. So you can really start to see at different times of day, different resources are responding. Before I get deeper into that explanation, you can see that this map does not look like any other map you've seen. That's primarily because grid boundaries typically don't respect political boundaries. And so the boundaries we use to report emissions actually align with something called balancing authorities or ISOs. So in New York, that's the NYISO, New York Independent System Operator. In New England, it's ISO-NE. Great Plains, it's SPP. Texas, it's ERCOT. PJM's kind of the mid-Atlantics. This whole region down here in the southeast is really a whole mix of smaller grid operators called balancing authorities, often vertically integrated, like utilities that also operate the grid. California's CAISO, BPA is up here in the Northwest. And these are the actual entities that control grid operations. So when you say, I need another megawatt hour of power, they tell a power plant to turn on instantaneously to meet that demand throughout the day. And so the way I like to explain the difference between marginal and an average is actually looking at this chart here. So this is called a dispatch curve or a merit order curve. And what it is are folks familiar with a chart like this?
No.
Yes.
No,
Okay, we're getting mostly no's. So you might have seen like a McKinsey curve where it says like the low cost things are first and how much savings you could get from them. This is really saying each of these bars represents a power producer in the market. So in New York, you have all your wind and solar, probably mostly wind at this point, hydro, nuclear, and they all tell the grid operator, I will produce power at this price. And so what the grid operator does is they take all those bids and line them up by price and say, okay, electricity demand is this high right now. Everything to the left of that needs to be running to meet that demand. And so if you draw this line over, that sets the market price and everyone in the market gets paid that price. And so what it essentially does is like in the middle of the day, there'll be more solar, but in the evening, the solar will drop out and something else will say I'm available. The fossil resources will be always available unless they're out for maintenance, which happens surprisingly often. And then all the grid operator does is they say, okay, we have all these different power plants that are bidding into the market. They all tell me their price. We have a certain level of demand, so all of these power plants need to be operating. And then that changes every 5 minutes, and they're constantly rebalancing it to make sure that they're reliably operating and meeting that demand. Am I making sense so far?
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Fabulous. So a clarification there is that this is the wholesale market for electricity. So very few of us as consumers actually see this price. Like your utility, ComEd, will buy power on your behalf and then essentially amortizes that cost across everyone's flat rate bill. And you can, I believe there's some retail choice. So you can actually select your utility provider and they're essentially managing that risk on your behalf. The prices will get really high. Where it's important is when you add load, a particular power plant is turning on to meet that additional demand. And that is the marginal generator. And so what we care about is at any given moment, if you add load, what type of power plant will produce more power and how much emissions will that cause? And so you get really interesting situations. Like there are some periods where there's an oversupply of renewable energy and we're actually throwing away wind or solar. That's a really good time to consume more power. And then another time we could be turning on really dirty peaker plants because oil and natural gas, or like there's a shortage of natural gas, so we're burning oil in those resources, and that's a really bad time, will cause lots more emissions. So that's kind of that's like That's the marginal emissions. Average emissions are, if you take all the emissions in the grid and divide it by all the generation, that's the average emissions rate. But that nuclear power plant is not going to adjust its load at any given time. So we're really interested in whose behavior will change if you change your behavior. In some markets, wholesale price doesn't correlate well with emissions because you could have low cost coal and high cost natural gas, or they could be all mixed together. So wholesale price is not always an indicator of how clean or dirty the grid is, but during exceptionally low price situations, you're probably seeing wasted renewables. Any questions on this before I go deeper into some of the applications of this data? Excellent. I just quickly, like, this dispatch curve is super clean and clear. Reality is a lot messier, so we use a lot of regression curves and causal modeling to actually determine what that responding unit is in the electric grid, because that's the key information we're trying to find out. And just to kind of illustrate the magnitude of this opportunity, this is solar curtailment in California, how much solar we're actually throwing away in any given period. And in April of this year, we broke records and threw away more than 700 gigawatt hours, almost a terawatt hour of power in a single month. So if more people just put their load in the middle of the day, whether that was through batteries or load flexibility, we could significantly reduce the emissions from the power grid, also significantly reduce power costs. There are many benefits to kind of load flexibility or taking advantage of intermittent demand. So shifting towards a paradigm where we're matching demand with supply instead of, historically, we've always matched power supply with demand. Was there a quick question there?
Observation, that's why the battery market is very important.
Absolutely, and we're starting to see gigawatt hours of batteries installed in California at this point. And if New York delivers on its promise of, I believe it's like 6 or 7 gigawatts of offshore wind, there's going to be a lot of opportunity to take advantage of time varying emissions. And so this is just a quick chart of grid emissions in California, and you can actually see the trough in the spring in California where there's a huge oversupply of solar because temperatures are still low, so AC is not running, but the sun is still strong, so there's a huge supply of renewable energy. And then in the summer, you still see that evening peak, afternoon peak when everyone's running their AC, especially towards the late evening when the sun's going down, but we have to turn on those really dirty generators. So that's how the grid works. What does this mean for buildings is kind of the logical next question. So on the left, you have marginal emissions rate. On the right, you have building electricity consumption, and you can start to see how they're not really talking to each other yet. I appreciate that laugh. Yeah, not at all. And so the question is, how do we start to shape load to begin to like respond to these conditions? And we've really identified 2 key strategies. One is like, can you design your building in when you're building it to have more intelligent systems, shading solutions, passive systems to really better match that grid that we think we're going to have? And then the other side of it is, can we actively control buildings to actually dynamically change their behavior in response to grid conditions? And those require 2 slightly different data sets. On the typical grid emissions profile, I think this audience may appreciate it. A lot of buildings are designed using TMY data, which is great for designing and getting a rough idea of how much energy a building will consume. But that data tends to be, weather data tends to be 20 or 30 years out of date. And so you have 2 different data sets. You have grid emissions from the past few years and 30 or 40 years of weather data. And you really actually have to like reconcile the difference in those 2 data sets. So this is just a quick what people call, someone coined typical meteorological year a long time ago. We've started calling typical carbon year, which is like how much emissions are there in any given hour that you can then assess different design strategies against that carbon profile. Just like you have energy efficiency measures, you can assess those measures against their carbon effectiveness. Like, is installing solar as effective as this system, or is a radiant system more carbon efficient than a other type of conditioning system? So that's one side, is like on the design side, can you make better design decisions from a carbon standpoint? And then on the other is, okay, is there a way that you can take active control of that building and make startup decisions, pre-cooling, active storage, passive storage, things like that in the building. And this is a much more challenging realm. I think historically, most building operators have been captured in the demand response world, which is kind of a very curtailment, occasional based paradigm where you're like, 12 times a year, I'm going to turn off as much equipment as I possibly can to get the most grid benefit or cost savings. And this is a more active control strategy, which is every day, can we make smarter startup decisions about the building? Can we pre-cool it? Can we take advantage of the thermal mass? Are there different, can we tune the equipment at different time scales so that you're running certain chillers at certain times? Can you preload air in a room so that you can coast through periods? And so you can start to see there are lots of strategies that are active controls, but they are definitely automated. They definitely need to be automated, and they need to act every day to achieve real effective carbon savings. Kind of a really intuitive example of this. This is a real world example of an EV that we have operating in Missouri, a whole set of charging infrastructure. So the blue box here is like the charge window. So you get home, you plug in your car, and under traditional behavior, it would start charging immediately. But you really don't need that car until 8 a.m. the next day. So this is a real charge window or a charging session from a vehicle. So they plugged in, at 8:50, out at 8:15, plugged in at 6. Historically, that would have just charged right away, but we worked with the EVSE manufacturer to actually schedule that load in the kind of middle of the night when there was an oversupply of wind. And so that was a 87% reduction in the amount of emissions caused by that charging behavior. So this is kind of like the ideal behavior. Of course, an EV is one of those loads that is super flexible in terms of you can turn it on and off really quickly.
Tesla supercharger, 8 to 10 kilowatts.
I believe it was a level 2 charger. Also, so 2 hours of charge, home charging. Why do you ask?
Most houses in this area don't have that infrastructure to put in 10 kilowatts for charging, but maybe California is different. I don't know.
This was exceptional. Also, I think honestly, this can be used for any infrastructure. So if you typically don't need a full charge. So if it's 2 hours of charge or an hour of charge, you can still spread that out considerably, or 4 hours of charge. It's really, can you put it in a better place? So this is kind of an introduction for how you can use carbon data, how it can be used under different applications. Where this also gets really interesting is that Local Law 97 actually has a TOU pathway. How deep do you all want me to go on this? Deep? Okay. So if someone wants it, we'll go there. So last year, at the end of the year, the Department of Buildings issued a kind of draft rulemaking, I believe. And so I dug through it and pulled out the relevant section here. But in that draft rulemaking, there's a section on what does the TOU compliance pathway look like. And so you can either show compliance using the predetermined annual factors, or you can show compliance by using this hourly emissions factor. And so what they did is they defined a methodology for calculating that hourly emissions factor so that different buildings could take advantage of that. And what it does essentially is it says, okay, what is the marginal emissions rate on the electric grid at any given moment? And then it gives you credit for, so I guess I should take a step back. So by using an hourly emissions rate, it gives credit to buildings that have the ability to flex load. So they're essentially saying, we recognize that energy storage, load flexibility is a kind of a developing technology area. And if you have that installed in your building, I know ice storage is pretty popular. in New York. And so if you could actually charge that ice storage at intelligent times and it's lower emissions, we will give you credit for that under the law. So it's opening up a whole new avenue of kind of building systems strategies that weren't available before under the law that take into account the time-based consumption of electricity. So whereas the annual emissions factor would just say all your electricity consumption is treated equally, this is now saying if you can intelligently control that, we will give you credit for that. So start thinking about night charging or ice storage. I know that there's some weird things around energy storage in the fire department in New York, electrochemical. So hope they're working through that. But what it does is essentially say is, what is the marginal emissions rate at any given time in the at any given hour? How different is that marginal emissions rate from the median marginal emissions rate over the past year? Actually, the mean, I should say. So now you've calculated the differential in any given hour from the marginal emissions rate, and then it applies that same factor to the annual emissions rate that is used for compliance with the law. So it's essentially saying, take the variation in the grid emissions factor and apply that to the annual compliance factor. So now that a building using the hourly compliance factor is comparable to a building using the annual compliance factor. And it's a super clever methodology to maintain comparability and alignment with the thresholds that were established under the law, because the annual factors are determined ahead of time, they're averages, they don't have the same granularity or magnitude as the hourly factor. So there's a kind of a clever normalization approach that's being undertaken there. I've included links here to those rulemakings. There's a lot of detail in them about how they calculate that marginal emissions rate using the heat rate of the power. And I can go into those details, but I think the rough idea is that we now have one data set that's hourly that has a lot of variation and is not aligned with the annual factor. So they normalize it to align with that annual factor. And now it is proposed to be available as the TOU compliance pathway through the law. Did that all make sense? I can go into any more of it in more detail, but that was really the stuff I wanted to cover here about granularity, emissions factors for the electric grid. Sorry, that was a bit muffled. Was that a question?
So, thank you, Henry. Thank you, Henry. Before we go to a panel, if there are one or two specific questions for Henry, we'll go to that. Yes, sir.
Yeah, did the time of use carbon, is a price integrated into that? Or do you need to optimize price, TOU price, and then TOU carbon on your own?
Because compliance with the law is calculated through carbon, it's like per ton. The thresholds are determined per ton per square foot, I believe. The compliance value is in tons as well, or emissions, but the penalty is in dollars. So you could think of it as a rate in a sense. If we have a moment, I'll actually pull up a different slide, but one of the things that we have seen very effectively done is if you assign a carbon price to the carbon, you can co-optimize that emissions rate as a price with whatever TOU or other utility rate that customer is on. Let me pull up a quick graphic that explains that here. So you're getting kind of unfiltered raw content. So sorry if there's a little bit of a mess. But so like, here's a traditional TOU rate in California. It has that evening peak because that's when power is really, wholesale power is really expensive in California. Here's the emissions rate by 5-minute period. You apply that carbon price, you stack them together, and you get a meaningful signal that a system can optimize for, while still maintaining the price signal and the carbon signal.
But over the course of a year, say for local law 97, which is how that's going to be calculated. How do I know my total year's marginal carbon contribution based on what I used and when I used it? Because the way it's currently calculated, is, right, total kWh in terms of gas in there. So how do you get from one size fits all, one price for all versus time of use carbon emissions?
So it's exactly the same, but instead of having a single carbon cost for every for all kilowatt hours that are consumed in the year, each hour will have a different emissions rate. And you are taking on that risk of not knowing what it is throughout the year.
And when do I know at the end of the year? Do I get a report from the utility that says to the ISO that this is the
If I understand it correctly, you will actually know 24 hours in advance what the emissions rate will be.
So Henry, this is based
On a
on the
day-by-day
day ahead
basis.
price, right? Is that your understanding, not the real time price?
It's built on the day ahead price. It might be built on the real time price. I'm not sure. The details are a little fuzzy to me at this point.
But as a utility customer, utility consumer, all of this is on the consumer to figure out your emissions on a day forward basis.
As of now, the way, as I understand the law, it's the customer's choice if they want to use a time of use option. And they hire a consultant to do this, basically this calculation, this
Yeah.
day by day, hour by hour calculation. And I'm not sure if you do the
And you would
calculation,
submit-
you can then switch back if you find it
I'm saying if you
unfavorable
didn't, even if you didn't switch back, then you would have to take that and submit that to DOB and say,
as part of your.
this is
filing.
my emissions, not just what
You have
Energy
to show the
Star.
method and it's involved.
Again, this is
It'll get standardized over
it's
time.
advantageous for people who can shift their loads to probably late evening, midnight, past midnight, things like that, where the carbon coefficient for the grid should be lower at late at night during normal times.
Right, as Henry said, people with ice storage on their big chiller plants, for example, expect to do well this optional calculation. I'm glad we're getting set up for the panel. Terry, you want to come up and sit up here and we'll start panel for Susie, you want to join? We do have one question, Henry, that came in online. So while we're getting ready for panel, is the near real time, and this is from Jim, is the near real time grid emissions are available from NISO. If the near real time grid emissions are available for NISO, why is local law 97 using a price-based implied price formula for emissions factors that has no direct correlation to grid emissions? I take it you can see that, read that.
Yes, and I think that's because the NISO actually hasn't published marginal emissions rates, in my understanding. They may be headed in that direction, I don't know. But the NISO has not actually published official emissions rates for downstate or even for New York City, I should say, Zone J. And so I believe the draft law actually says until such time that the NISO does publish emissions rates for Zone J, you shall use this other methodology. So if you can pressure the NISO to do that, that would be fabulous. I look forward to that.
Jim, does that speak to your question? You can probably be heard, but I'm not sure if not, you can.
Yeah, no, it does, Bob. It does. I appreciate it. It's just a question that's been, Henry, just to the point, I mean, doesn't Watt Time actually have emissions data from NISO as well? I mean, it's not an issue if it's not available. I mean, I really don't understand why it can't be used.
We haven't actually seen that much emissions data for NISO, especially downstate or Zone J. They report total emissions for the system. They don't report an emissions rate for Zone J or a marginal emissions rate for Zone J, which is substantially higher because of there's no wind or not much wind and hydro downstate.
Okay.
We do have emissions rates, but we are suggesting to the DOB, we are advocating that they actually, instead of putting the calculation onus on every building operator, but that the DOB actually publishes an official emissions data set that can be used for compliance calculations.
Good answer, Andy. So before we go on, I want to thank all our speakers. Gentlemen, on. Susie, if you want to join us up here, you're welcome to. I do want to just say in summary, you know, three disparate, seemingly disparate presentations, but you know, they all share this increasing granularity of data that we're getting to. And you know, this was we started with this as AMI, you know, advanced metering, which means granular data. And you know, at the same time as we're getting this metering data, you know, 5 million meters at 100 data points, 100 bits of information, 100 reads a day at 15-minute intervals. That's 500 million bits of information a day. Without the BAS data, which is a whole other, you know, what is there, 1,000 points in a building, in a large building. So we really get into big data. And you know, the question is how we use it up. And I think we can see, you know, the BAS tells us very granularly what's happening with specific pieces of equipment at specific times that can be timestamped. Then we move to David, who's trying to determine what's the impact of changing, you know, we do things strategically with equipment, with different pieces of equipment, and it gets reflected in the meters. And then David says, well, how can we see that impact with the data? Right? And then on top of that, we lay this other thing of, oh, okay, but what's the carbon implication of that? You know? So they all join together in this kind of data fusion. I think that's really where this conversation is going to head. Yeah, I see a question in the back, Chris.
To follow up on that, Mike, so that's a lot of data and most people can't look at that. It's far too much even for big, you know, systems. With the development of AI and opportunities to kind of really spartan the grid, where will we be in 10 years?
Well, I'll take a quick stab at that. Yes, so time series databases, as I mentioned, there's tons of them now, and they're getting less and less expensive, and some of them are open source, and so they are able to, you know, house and make accessible, you know, just tons of data, and then tools for doing that. Some visualization tools, we use one open source one called Grafana, which is still what I call human in the loop, right? But it allows you to look at in a very, very easy way a lot of information. So you still need human beings to look at it, but it's a start. And then of course you've got all this machine learning, and there's just a ton of applications that are going, and a ton of research. You know, currently I sit on one of the or at least I listen into Annex 81, which is the International Energy Association's smart building group. And it's just a bunch of PhDs from different universities, and they're all doing what I would call data-driven research. So we're going to see that doesn't take the human out of the loop, but it allows, you know, I mean, even some of the regression models that were talked about, you know, I mean, that's still using a lot of modeling, machine learning, math to crunch it. And I do think we're going to, you know, that's where it's headed. And that's going to get better, cheaper, easier. Because it is a lot of data, no question about it. And we can't have an army of human beings trying to digest that.
So can I ask what it looks like from, you know, the right middle of the afternoon light on the West Coast? Response to that question?
I don't know if you heard it.
I heard the mid-afternoon light in California.
Yeah, I said, how does an answer to that question look like from the West Coast?
The home of tech and big data. I think what we see is that are there meaningful insights that you can draw from the data? And the kind of related piece is measurement alone is insufficient. It needs to translate back into action. So we've seen a lot of measurement solutions, but the real challenge is, can you actually then take that information and change how the building operates to respond to the large amounts of data? I don't know if that's a fair answer. Like, we've seen a lot of data collection without much purpose, but then we really want to see, okay, how do we take that data and turn it into action?
I would agree that we could use certainly, but
Were you about to say something, David?
Oh, yeah, I was just going to contribute a little bit in M&V. You know, one thing you need to do is be able to have confidence in the savings results, and you have to publish the data you looked at, what you did to prepare it, how you analyzed it, how you came up with savings. And if we get into AI, you know, it all becomes machine learning, complicated algorithms on computer platforms, and we kind of lose that. You know, not everybody's an AI expert, not everybody's a data scientist. We're going to lose some of that confidence in those numbers, and indeed there could be, you know, malfeasance in there. So we're going to have to pay attention to how we maintain our confidence in our M&D results, I think. We all have ideas on how we could do that, but I think that's going to be an issue.
Chris, maybe you can address that question to Chat GPT in the interim.
I have a question related to that, in that, like, okay, there's the malfeasance aspect, but then there's also, in, you know, the kind of analysis that I learned, the way that you analyze the data also has physical significance in the building itself. And then when you start feeding, you know, certain machine learning algorithms, you just put in a bunch of, you know, independent variables, and here's your dependent variables, and then, you know, come up with a way to predict the outcome, but it doesn't necessarily tell you how it has arrived at that answer. So you might get a very good answer that might provide you with very good and accurate predictions, but without the same kind of understanding of how you got to that point. You know, specifically, you know, talking about like large language models and stuff like that, or their equivalents for dealing with this type of data. How do we, or I don't know, like, what are the available strategy, or is that a problem? Like, to me, I look at that and I think, oh, that's a bad thing, and I don't really understand how this process is working, so I want to avoid that. But I can imagine there's another school of thought that says that is not an issue, but I'm skeptical and suspicious of it.
I think there's some really useful places for models like that. So forecasting. So like, we're really careful about the models that we use to generate marginal emissions estimates of the electric grid. But training a model that forecasts that out 72 hours, we don't really need to know the underlying levers. We just give it features and see if it likes those features. And we actually test for something called efficacy, not accuracy, because we want to know how effective is that signal at achieving reductions, which is actually more important than the accuracy of the forecast signal. And then you assess the actual performance of your load shifting strategy against the historical data. But if it's a black box generating those forecasts, we don't particularly care. Does that, as long as it's doing a good job and improving.
David, can I ask you another version of that question, which is, doesn't it kind of keep you up at night that you know, you're doing M&V on a set of measures and you get a result that seems consistent, but you're not sure if maybe there's something else completely, something distinct that's happening that's causing the effect that you're seeing? Doesn't that kind of give you a nightmare?
You're talking about non-routine events, and I spoke about that a little bit. And you can get fluctuations for small NREs throughout your performance year. Those aren't going to make a big difference in the overall result. So it's the large ones that you care about, significant adds or removes and loads, that really affect your savings analysis. And yeah, I think as this field is evolving, and I do want to stress that interval data M&D is evolving, we're starting to, and with exogenous effects like COVID and having to account for that, it's forced us to really take a step back and say, well, what about these issues? How do we handle them? And so to your specific question, I would say there's a track that's in parallel, and it's very similar to fault detection, is just anomaly detection and energy use data. How do you use your tools, whether they're statistical or probabilistic or physical, how do you use those to say, wait, that's unusual behavior over a period of time? That must be a non-routine event. And so if you have the data, there's going to be ways developed to detect those kind of things. It's also going to be fairly data intensive and analysis intensive, but I think that's those algorithms and skills and tools are going to evolve, quickly as this becomes more and more in use.
Yeah, I'm not thinking of a non-routine event necessarily, but of a, I've made an adjustment and at the same time, some major tenant has moved out. And so I see a drop in the energy usage that should be reported, for my model, but it's not, it goes unreported and it's a completely separate factor. But we can leave that aside. There are a bunch of questions. We have 2 follow-up questions, but I want to go to new questions. Sir, and can we please say your name just so we get to know each other in the room? Okay?
All right, sure. Martin Nolan, and I'm curious if you've seen anyone work with this modeling. I was interesting, I think what it is you, Terry, talks about how you can decipher what the problem may be based on the changes of the data. Has anyone actually brought together the maintenance schedules, what maintenance has done, which would be typically codified very differently than your other energy data, and tried to run your AI ML on that? Have you ever seen that done, heard about it done, somebody tried and failed?
We certainly see, we think, part of the applications that will and from this would be a computerized maintenance management software. So we're seeing those tools integrated into the BAS trend data, the FDD data. And we think that is a great application to marry with all that information. So that you can see long-term impact of maintenance on a piece of equipment. You can certainly see in the data the degradation or the loading of filters, for instance, right? Just from delta T on a before after or pressure. So a lot of that can be gotten. We don't see a lot of that yet, but we know that as we collect more and more of this data, there's certainly going to be ways to use it. I do think we're in a point right now where we can collect data better and faster and cheaper than we can absorb it at the moment. No question about that. But I think those tools, again, there's data scientists that was just at a BAS conference and, for one vendor, and they have a data scientist now. It's the first time I've ever heard of a BAS vendor having a data scientist, but, so yeah, we have a lot of information.
Yeah, Henry did some really interesting stuff, particularly in your last slide or two there about local law 97. Given that what we know about the different e-grid regions and how there are such variations in emissions, even in ones next to one another, as it comes to local law 97, I've been looking into this difference between GWP 20 and GWP 100. There is quite a significant difference at times. How is the general public or professionals, energy professionals, not emissions professionals, supposed to even start these calculations? Are we doing it on the GWP 20, which New York State uses, unlike most anybody else, or the GWP 100, which is the readily available data from the EIA? And I'd like you to tell me, is that something, which does the NISO and all the rest of the data geeks using that they can even start to feed into these models? I would assume it's the 100, but I would appreciate your input.
That's a really good question that I don't know the answer to. I have seen some of the entities that we work with report both because of the importance of this question. I can't recollect what the law actually says about this, and I think it does specify it. I apologize, I'm not more helpful in this sense.
No, thank you. At least you gave me what information you did have, so thank you.
Yeah, it's like what the car guys, remember the car guys? They used to call that game Stump the Chumps.
Points to whoever stumped.
Yes, I'm sorry. First.
My name is Janelle Bailey. I work for Con Edison. And my question is, I think it's more tailored to David Jump. I read in a white paper that came out by EVO that there are still some open issues when it comes to AM and V and using aggregated methods. So maybe a utility or portfolio manager may want to see what's the energy savings or demand savings across a portfolio of buildings. I'm wondering if in the past couple of years, there have been some industry standards set for how do you perform AM and V when you're aggregating across hundreds, if not thousands of buildings.
Yeah, you're talking about population approaches, multiple buildings.
Yeah, multiple buildings.
Yeah, that's traditionally been done for, residential properties because you get a lot of participants with small savings, and you really can't see any savings unless you start aggregating all of them, and the signal becomes stronger compared to the noise. There are advances in that. There are efforts to do that in the commercial sector, and the benefit is, in theory, these so-called randomized control trials, they're not exactly, you can't actually do that. But you can set up treatment and comparison groups. And the comparison groups are untreated buildings, so they don't get the energy efficiency measures. And those have to be quite large. I forget what the ratios are. They're hundreds, or maybe they're 5 times larger than the treatment group in population. But the untreated buildings give you the natural change in energy use, and that's the participants in the members of the treatment group, the control group, include those that would do energy efficiency projects anyway, as well as those who don't really care about it, but they're also affected by economic conditions and everything. And so that control group tells you the amount of naturally occurring change in energy use. And the treatment group naturally has similar representation of people, but they also have the energy efficiency measures. They were treated with those measures. So, yeah, I'm sorry, I get long-winded. So it's a differences approach. You calculate the total savings, the difference between the baseline and post-installation use in the treatment group and in the control group. And then you subtract those two numbers and you get net savings. And that's net of exogenous effects like COVID and occupancy and economic conditions. All the little NREs kind of melt away when you have large populations. It's also net of influence. But the problem is the volume of the groups, the number of the groups. And so some innovations lately that I can tell you about are the development of granular profiles. So in the commercial sector, you might have, 100 buildings that are similar to your treatment building. And you can, similar to what we did with the example I showed, take the energy use of those buildings and average them together. And that creates a granular profile, and you can use that granular profile in your target building, your treated building, to account for the net effects. And then there's debate about whether that includes, naturally occurring exogenous effects as well as the impact of program influence, but I'll leave that for the statisticians to argue about. But so I just sort of gave you what's going on and developments that we're seeing with these large populations. I don't know if I answered your specific question.
I'm just curious before we move on, and we have time for a couple more questions. How many people in the room have been exposed to rigorous measurement and verification procedures? We're all energy managers or energy engineers. So yeah, so maybe half the people in the room. Okay. Yes. And your name first? I didn't.
Yeah,
ask you.
hi, everyone. I'm James Hanna from a company called Parity. The question that I think is more for Terry and Henry, you in different ways in your presentations, you talked about the need for buildings to be more flexible and to automate the way that buildings respond to what's going on the grid or potentially even what's going on within the building. So I guess you referred to it as ASOs, I think, Terry, and my question is, how do we get the building operators who have controlled these buildings manually? They've spent decades or, very long time, learning the little, tinkers and way to tweak these buildings to get on board with that type of an approach, right? Because in some ways you're sort of handing over the keys a little bit to an algorithm to make these automated control adjustments. I just, I know we've been a lot of talk about the technology and everything, but some of it's people aspect of this. I'm just curious if either of you guys have any thoughts on how that transition might play out.
Well, I do want to add, Henry's conversation, like there's this terminology that the DOE has come up with recently called GAB, G-E-B, Grid Interactive Efficient Building. And so they're really pushing, DOE is really pushing interactive buildings. I also, there's a terminology called terms, distributed energy resource management. All that will require, and we like this thing, Henry's talk was sort of new to me in terms of the dirtiness of the grid. We have been working with some labs on granular real-time management of KW, right? And the control, because it is a controls problem. So we like that. No question that operators are going to have to be brought in. There's no question that they know how their BAS works now. And all of a sudden we're going to add all these, the optimizations we're talking about aren't even sort of KW related, they're KWH related. Now those algorithms are going to have to look at the cost of saving or the cost of reducing, say, demand. We may actually incur additional KWH when we reduce demand based on either real-time pricing or the dirtiness of the grid or some combination of it. So there's no question it's a complex algorithm that a typical control system today certainly can't calculate. But there's going to be models and hopefully more gray box models, so they won't be completely black box and no one will understand what they're doing. But no question, training of building operators, and then hopefully some faith in the system. We think a lot of problems with operators overriding things, and I'll use optimal start as one. It's a strategy that's one of the most productive, cost-effective, or energy-saving strategies. It's optimal start and stop. And it's been in the industry for 30-some years, and it gets deployed very infrequently. And because operators don't they like to know that at some particular time in the morning, this air handler is going to start or this chiller is going to start. And if that starts varying based on, based on the weather and all that, so operator training, no question about it. They have to be brought on. And then hopefully we do it, the controls guys do it right. So that they won't override it. Because obviously part of the problem has been controls have not been working correctly and they eventually just say, I'm going to quit that active reset because it's not working right. Hopefully not, or I don't understand why it's doing it. So there's going to have to be training and faith from the operators that let's let the machine try to do it correctly. We'll give it a chance.
Henry, did you want to weigh in on this?
No, that sounds great. I think the other side of that coin is incentive. So there has to be a reason to start shifting load in an automated fashion, whether that's price or emissions or some other set of factors. But right now, a lot of those signals are absent in the rate structures or in the building world. I don't know if you'd agree with that.
It's a very acute question because the operators will be confused by what the equipment is doing from the controls. And we know when an operator doesn't understand what's happening, he's going to go to manual.
Chris Hahn, kind of a follow-up to that, and thank you, Mike, for arranging the three different parties here. They have a spectrum of usage. And so the issue is they're all conservative entities. The utility is very conservative. The RTO is very conservative. Building trades and building people are very conservative, as is the OEMs. How do you get this disparate group to adopt quicker change that we all need because of our climate issues. That also says, hey, why do you go with AI? Because that is maybe a way, but what's your perceived? Is it rate issues? The utility rate making are very slow in their approaches. So what are some of not the silver bullets, but some of the things that you see in your space that really need to change so we can get to that smart grid and where we want to go?
I'm glad I don't have to answer on that.
I agree with Henry that right now, at least in the mid-Atlantic, we're not seeing a lot of incentive from the utilities. And I agree with you, they're a little backwards, most of them. I think there's some that are progressive, but many of them are, I don't know, slow to act. Policy, local law 97 is an example. I mean, we have a few buildings in New York City, and I would tell you, one of them we're a client of ours for the last 5 or 7 years, and they didn't seem like they really cared about energy at all for a long time. That seemed to change recently. And I don't know if they're calculating what their penalty might be. I'm thinking that's it. So that incentive, which is sort of a stick incentive, the carrot incentive from the utilities to start, incentivizing for demand management actively based on either price and or carbon or some combination of it, both of those. And then, training, hopefully, I actually see the younger generation kind of natively care about the environment more than us older guys did, or do, to be honest with you. So, I see younger engineering firms that are in the space that I am that really have so I do think just some generation change is going to help this as well. You know what I mean?
David, Henry?
One
Yeah, I
quick
agree
thing
with
I
you
would,
about the younger generation. Sorry, Henry, I'll go. I'm gonna grab this in order. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I think economics would be the path to most rapid change. But yeah, I think we're kind of stuck in the slow cycle. This visualization that you can actually get value out of saving energy is one of the first things I would go to. And I tried to show a little bit of that in my presentation. You can monetize energy efficiency savings. I think you can monetize carbon savings as well, but let Henry talk about that. But I don't have a lot of ideas for rapid change, unless it's political or legal or something like that. Raise prices, show savings that has repercussions. Sorry, that's it.
the only thing I would add, which is somewhat optimistic, is we're actually seeing change in devices voluntarily. Like Windows Update now schedules your update based on how clean or dirty the electric grid in your region is. The Nest thermostat can dynamically adjust your set points based on carbon just because people want that. And so I think there's a groundswell for this. Like honestly, the rate savings on a utility bill for a typical consumer through load flexibility is very low, but the motivation may be for carbon to sign up for a program like that.
So that's an interesting last word. Thank you, Henry. Oh, I'm sorry. Do we have time for one more quick question? Okay, and people have to take the exam. Do people in the room know how to do the exam also?
They don't have to, only.
Just the online.
Okay, yes.
Yeah.
Last question.
I'm from Debonair here. Like, I'm just want to ask, like, have you guys seen any building that is like reactive to the grid?
Well, we've all seen lots of demand response, but you mean beyond that?
Yes, beyond that, I'm saying like in a daily basis, like peak demand management or capability.
So UE has funded, I don't know how many of these GEV. There's one going on in Washington. I think there's one at Oak Ridge. There's a residential one out there. I see it more from a DOE funded lab experiment at this point. But I suspect in California, again, this is the Mid-Atlantic, all we have at the moment is what I call dumb demand response, which are those 10 or 11 days, you know what I mean? West Coast, though, is probably a little more advanced, right? Henry?
It's still a rumor to me.
We've seen it in a couple places, mostly in research contexts, but batteries are the cheap and easy way of doing it. And there are a couple buildings we can't talk about yet, but when we do, we will be trumpeting them everywhere where they're actually taking a dynamic signal and making carbon decisions on an active basis. It's a lot harder than this.
Yeah, good question. So it's a concept with a plan, maybe. So thank you very much for attending. Craig, anything to close out the meeting?
Thank you, Michael and Sissy, and our speakers. We hope to see everybody at the gala in June. Have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
David, Henry, thank you. Thanks, David.
Yeah.